and then so this is our Bible study for Wednesday night, the second in the series on the similarities and the differences among the four Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Couple of the highlights that we raised last week in looking at all of the Gospels was the difference in time that they were written, and the different kind of the source materials, or where they got the information that they're now putting into a written document. Essentially, who they've talked to, who they've interviewed, what eyewitnesses have contributed to this this now written presentation. Before we get move on for this week, I had suggested that if you had the time to read through Mark's Gospel during this past week, and to read it with a kind of a question in your mind, and you can still do this exercise in the next week if this makes sense, but have the question in your mind: why does Mark so often use the word immediately, or or something very similar to immediately, that is clearly trying to communicate the immediacy of something? What is it? Martha and Jules, they did the homework, and I would just be very interested. Yeah, I'd be very interested in your having just read Mark. What kinds of things pop out at you that maybe you've always known, or maybe this was the first time you noticed it?
I guess I've always known it, but okay. In my Bible, this is the student Bible, and it goes into the authorship, the setting, the date, the occasions, all of the various, the style, the composition, genre, emphasis, all of this in the introduction. And its relation to other Gospels. Mark has been overshadowed by the other Gospels through most of the church's history. Compared with Matthew and Luke, it contains little of the teaching associated with Jesus, and none of the stories of his birth and resurrection.
Let me stop you there, because that's a really important point. Especially, that was the other one that I asked you to look for as you were reading Mark, was how often, not only does he use immediately, but how often does he say, "And Jesus began to teach the crowd," and then the next sentence is a miracle. It's not any kind of teaching.
Right. He doesn't talk much about the teaching. But
he describes the teaching by the actions that Jesus takes.
Right.
So rather than
miracles.
Yeah. And all of the miracles are teachings of Jesus.
Yes.
They're enactments of what Jesus is trying to teach us.
Yeah.
Now, it's important to note that Mark, here comes Marge, Marge is coming on. I'm going to wait for her to plug in. And I hope Iris will too. Hello, Marge. Oh, Marge, can you hear it? Oh, goodness. We've had this trouble before. I don't know if you can hear me, Marge, but
You have to get a new
let's see,
computer.
you are now muted. If you're on your phone, I think *6 will change that. Is that right?
I think so.
No idea, because we have a problem.
We're not in a position to be able to remedy this, so I guess all we can do is go on.
Okay.
Hopefully she can at least hear you.
Pardon me?
Hopefully she can at least hear.
Yeah.
Even if she can't speak to us.
Yeah, that's a shame. She and Iris always ask really good questions. Everybody does. Actually, that's for me what part of the fun of the Bible study is, that responding to the curiosity or the interests of the people who are in the Bible study. Unfortunately, that leaves the people who watch by Zoom, watch later, kind of out of the picture. But so it's important to note that Mark was the first gospel written. And when that commentary that you were reading, Jules, makes reference to the relationship to the other gospels.
Yeah.
Luke and Matthew clearly had Mark in front of them when they wrote their gospels.
That's what they say.
Yeah, and we'll talk in a little bit more detail about that in just a bit. I want to stick with Mark first, kind of because it was the first, kind of understanding what it is that Mark is laying out for us.
What year are we speaking in? What is it? When was this written?
Somewhere around 60 AD. So it's a whole generation, maybe even a generation and a half after the resurrection of Jesus.
Mhm.
There's no contemporaneous, or at the time of Jesus's life, there was nobody taking notes and writing the story of Jesus. When Christianity, when Jesus rose from the dead and commissioned his disciples to go out and tell the good news to the ends of the earth, what they did was they told what they had heard from Jesus, and they passed it on. They passed on the teachings of Jesus, the stories about Jesus, and their own impressions, as you might say, of Jesus. And they passed that on to an audience that probably originally was just their own local congregation. By this time, Christianity, thanks to St. Paul, had expanded around much of the northern part of the Roman Empire. So in just 50 or so, fewer than that, years between the resurrection of Jesus, Paul died in about 64. So that's really only a 30-year span in which the church was planted throughout the northern Mediterranean, in all the key cities, cities that we know of, because it's Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, Corinthians, Romans. These are all documents that come out of those Christian communities that were set up, organized, and established, you might say, in the first generation of Christianity.
Paul.
Paul, go ahead.
Mostly
Jules?
Mostly by Paul.
Yes, exactly. Mostly by Paul. Paul, you might remember, you know the story of his conversion from being a zealous Christian-hating Jew into a Christian at the Damascus. It's a wonderful story, but we're not going to go in detail into that. But he felt the specific calling by God to take the good news, the gospel, to the Gentiles, and it caused friction in the early church, because there were people who were very, very adamant that Christianity was not a new religion, it was the fulfillment of Judaism. And it was the fullness of the promise was available, was there for the Jews. Therefore, to become part of this new Zion, you needed to become a Jew first and go through the process of becoming a Jew. And of course, except for the Jews in Judah, the rest of the Roman Empire had no interest in becoming Jews.
Mhm.
And the breakthrough for Paul was to hear God saying, no, this gospel is for all people, and I am appointing you specifically to be the apostle to the Gentiles. Early in the book of Acts, and we have studied the book of Acts before. It's always a fallback book for me, because it's the account of the recollection of the earliest days of the Christian church, and that apostolic era, we call it, when the apostles still lived. You know, we in our creed every week, we talk about it, apostolic church. And that means that we believe that we are directly connected to the teaching of the apostles themselves, and that it's not just conventions of theologians who come together and declare this, that, and the other doctrines and stuff like that. It is a generation to generation to generation connection. Here comes Iris. Connection going back to the apostles themselves. Hi, Iris.
Iris, put your phone on.
You're on mute, Iris.
Unmute.
Okay, now
Okay.
you're,
Unmute yourself.
there you
Okay,
go.
I'm gonna be eating my dinner while I talk to you. I'm so sorry, I totally forgot. I've got like so many doctor's appointments. I'm so confused here. Okay,
Oh, but
sorry.
we're glad you're here with us.
okay.
Marge, we think, is on listening, but we can't hear her.
No, she called me, told me to come. So she's
Okay.
here, I know.
Okay, and I guess we just can't hear her. Where was I? Sorry.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry.
No. I just
How
lost
about
my
the
train.
Apostolic Church?
Oh, yeah. So we seriously believe that that the Holy Spirit has ensured through the ages that the purity of the gospel has been preserved from apostolic times to our own times, and it is our calling, part of our stewardship, to make sure it's passed on to another generation. That doesn't mean, and this is obviously kind of critical to people living in the 21st century, it doesn't mean that we just recreate the apostolic church or try to recreate the apostolic church. That was an institution that developed. It originally was a movement, but as with many movements, and it was a revolutionary movement. The Romans thought it was, and tried to put it down. A key thing to keep in mind was at the time that these Gospels were written, there was this ongoing conflict between the Jews and the Christians about whether Christians were Jews or heretics. And basically the conclusion of the Jewish leaders was that they were heretics, and that it was okay to cooperate with the Roman government to put them down. And that was what was going on kind of politically in the middle and late first century, which is the time when the Gospels were written. Excuse me. So, excuse me. So, Mark is writing from one of those congregations. We don't know for sure from where. We also, just to remind you, we don't know who Mark is. Mark is you wouldn't call it a pseudonym, but it is a honorary, somebody given honorary authorship of somebody else's work. It's kind of the opposite of plagiarism. It's putting someone else's name on your work. And that was okay. And that was done in ancient classical literature. That was considered a way of honoring a mentor, would be to put his name on your work. Go ahead, Iris.
Why don't we know who Mark is?
There's no trace. Mark is never identified in the document. There's no evidence anywhere other than tradition where this came from, and the tradition has assigned it to Mark. But even this Mark, you don't know Mark as one of the disciples.
No.
So it just is not clear who Mark is, other than that he is there are conclusions that that scholars come to based on his style of writing, and particularly his point of view and what's important to him. And in Mark, that the whole trajectory of the gospel of this work is hanging over all of it is the question, is Jesus the Messiah? And that question gets raised over and over and over throughout the book. It's almost humorous, if it weren't so ingenious, to see throughout the book when that question is raised. It's the most humble and also the demons who recognize Jesus as the Messiah and call him as such. The leaders, of the political leaders and the religious leaders, just scoff at the notion that this carpenter's son has any of the resume to be the Messiah. And Mark is laying the making the case that Jesus is in fact the Messiah expected from of old by the Jewish people. Let me stop there for a second and see if you have questions. Martha.
Okay, well, 3 things that we talked about when we read it this afternoon. Number 1, there is no nativity story in Mark. Okay. Number 2, Mark is really into the miracles that Jesus performed over and over and over and over again. And then third, there is the end of Mark, the resurrection story, with a second story, which is I said to Jules this afternoon, we never on Easter read Mark on Easter.
No, it's disturbing.
Isn't it? Yes.
For those, and this is one of the points I was going to go to, but I'll go there now.
Okay, we go so much. Sorry.
To actually both of these points, there is no nativity scene, there is no birth scene. Jesus appears on the scene as a grown man
With John
in his 30s. Just appears on the scene out of nowhere in Mark's gospel.
Yeah.
Similarly, at the very end, it ends, as I said, in a very unsatisfying way. The women go into the tomb and they see that the tomb is empty. They hear an angel say he is risen. Go tell the disciples. And the women leave the tomb and are, dumbstruck, but go and tell the disciples. Now, even very, very early in the circulation of Mark's gospel among Christian churches, someone decided that ending was not satisfactory. And they wrote another ending that has I don't have it in front of me, but I think it has an appearance of Jesus to somebody. I can't remember who it was, but it's clearly a later attempt to say, no, the resurrection is key to our whole message. We've got to have a resurrection story in here. And so where Mark left things very much in in a suspenseful tension. This later editor tried to resolve that. Scholars believe that Mark's intent, that first, what they call the original ending of Mark, that doesn't have a resurrection appearance by Jesus.
And then the longer ending.
Right. That original ending was intended by Mark to leave you in such a what kind of place that you would say, I need to read this again. I need to read this again to understand it. And then you would go back to the beginning, and it becomes circular, always around the question, is Jesus the Messiah? And again, that apparently was kind of, in terms of literature, was carefully designed by Mark, and then kind of a later editor gave us this little off-ramp from that tension to a little bit of resolution. Let me stop there, and yeah, Mike, you've got a question.
Yeah, I do. Do we know if Mark didn't believe there was a resurrection, or he took editorial license and wrote his own story his way? How does
I think the best scholarship that I know is that he was saying, okay, there's an angel here, there's a message from God, the women are sent back to take that message, and it's now that message is in the hands of the church, is in the hands of those whom Jesus commissioned to carry on his ministry. It was not, again, in Mark's conceptualization, it was not necessary for the disciples or anyone else to see the risen Lord. In Mark's gospel, Jesus is presumably resurrected into heaven, and there's no after Easter appearances. So it's a different presentation. Whether Mark knew of stories about after the resurrection, Jesus' appearances, whether he knew them or not, we have no way of saying. If he did, he didn't use them, which, at least to me, suggests that he didn't have them kind of in his purview, in his sources. Other questions at this point? Yes, Martha.
Well, then, as the third thing I said was, it is so full of miracles, this gospel, one miracle after another. It doesn't end,
Right. Yeah, and that's attached, as I said earlier, in almost every case, when Mark says, and Jesus began to teach, and then he performs a miracle. There's no narrative of what Jesus said.
No.
When we get to Matthew and Luke, we've got that, and John, which is kind of a separate category. But Mark has, like, you've seen red letter editions of the Bible. Have you seen that, where supposedly all of the words of Jesus
Are in red,
are in red.
right.
And when you when you look at a Bible like that, and you see, compared to the other gospels, how little red there is in Mark's gospel. It's just the teachings, the words of Jesus aren't there, but it's
Well, he did.
repeatedly, it's Jesus began to teach and
Right, right.
saw a woman with palsy and healed her. Saw a, it just, it's over and over and over. It's the deeds he does is the teaching. It's not words that may or may not be applied to real life. It's real life that may or may not be able to be articulated in words. It's the idea of the ministry of Jesus is proclaimed, and that's a word kind of idea, but it's proclaimed in word and deed. And in Mark's gospel, it's especially in deed. And the kinds of miracles that Jesus does are fairly closely kind of orchestrated to connect with issues that arose in ancient Israel, in Israel's history. Their struggle in the wilderness, the rise of Israel as a kingdom, the fall of Israel as a kingdom, Israel going into exile, Israel rebuilding. These are themes that are picked up, or images that are picked up by Mark in these the selection of stories of Jesus' miracles that he presents. Let me stop again, see if you have questions. Okay. The other issue that you raised was the lack of a nativity, the lack of a birth story of Jesus. And undoubtedly, Mark had to have had some familiarity with the traditions about Jesus, the stories about Jesus. Again, none of this was written down. Luke hadn't been written yet for another 20 years. Matthew wouldn't be written again yet for another 20 years. But it's hard, at least for me, I can't speak for all people, but it's hard for me to imagine a Christian congregation anywhere that doesn't have a kind of a foundational understanding that Jesus is somehow God incarnate. And in Luke and Matthew, we get kind of the narrative of how that happens. In John, we get a dissertation, beautifully written dissertation on the relationship of Jesus to basically God. But in Mark, we don't.
Yes, we do.
Go ahead.
At the baptism. This is my beloved son.
Where I'm well pleased, right.
That's right. So there we go.
And that's critical. Thank you, Martha. That's critical because it is at his baptism that Jesus, perhaps for the first time, hears his call, hears his identity proclaimed as the Son of God. And again, the whole rest of the book is about what does this Son of God / Messiah, how can Jesus possibly be the Messiah? And then the argument kind of in support of the thesis that Jesus is the Messiah.
I think all the miracles that he performed established that fact in for anybody who was there. And there were apparently thousands and thousands.
Right. Mike?
So you said that Mark was written, or it took place when Jesus was 30 years old. So is that when Jesus realized that he was a son of God?
According to Mark's presentation, that seemed, well, we know from Mark, we know nothing at all about his upbringing. There's a reference to his mother and his brothers and sister. There is
More of that.
there's a reference to his being carpenter's son. And that comes out later in the narrative. It's not like we have a story about Jesus being the son of the carpenter or anything like that. It's just they're mockingly saying, how can he speak with such authority? He's a carpenter's son.
Right.
So there is in Mark, and why I think Mark is so fascinating and frustrating is that no, there's no backstory for Jesus. There's no origin story for Jesus. He is at his baptism. He's called by God, named Son of God. And that begins a ministry that ends with him on the cross. Although we would say, and we would claim, that it continues, that same ministry that Jesus began continues through the church, which he established to carry it on. First through the apostles, and then from each generation since then. Mark has no interest in Jesus' origin. Mark also has no interest in proving that Jesus was raised from the dead. Mark wants to focus on this. Jesus of Nazareth was on the day of his baptism called by God, identified as God's beloved son, and then sent on a, depending on how you count, a 2 or 3 year journey of ministry with some ups and downs, with some threats throughout it, with gathering support, gathering controversy. It ends as, and throughout it, as we've said, it is Jesus teaches by his actions.
Yeah.
And that's over and over again. Then we get into the what we call the Passion narratives, which begin with Palm Sunday and end with Easter. Mark is very sparse in his narration of the trial and so on of Jesus.
Right.
It's kind of bare bones, you might say. He presents the facts as he understands them, and And that's it. And then the book ends again, as we've talked about, with this frustratingly huge question mark. What did it all mean? It is he the Messiah? Here's an ingenious part of the structure of Mark's gospel. Mark has a number of scenarios in the gospel where there's mountaintop, and then they come down from the mountain, and then they go up to a mountain and they come down from a mountain. And in all of those cases, the geography is supposed to be kind of connote the value or the solemnity of the mountaintop events and the commonality of the down in the valley part of the narrative. In Mark's gospel, there are a couple of the big mountaintop experiences. One is the Transfiguration. Just before the beginning of Jesus' ascent into Jerusalem, where he would be crucified. Not just before, but quite a while before. When the disciples and Jesus had been facing a whole lot of opposition to their understanding of Judaism, to Jesus' understanding of Judaism, as he was enacting it with these various miracles. And there was resistance in the Jewish authorities, and there was suspicion among the Roman authorities. Different interests. The Jews were interested in the teaching. The Romans were interested in the rabble-rousing potential of this movement that Jesus was igniting. But when things were looking kind of grim, kind of an uphill slog, Jesus took his three favorite disciples, you'd say, and experienced what is referred to as the Transfiguration. We have no idea what, factually what happened, but it's an absolutely wonderful story of Jesus and Moses and Elijah, the two greatest prophets of the Old Testament, two greatest prophets of Israel, together on this mountaintop, glowing, which is in Hebrew parlance is kind of a manifestation of the sacred. If you remember when Moses used to go up on Mount Sinai to converse with God while they were in the wilderness, and when he would come down, his face would be shining, and the Israelites said, "Put a veil over your face when you come down from the mountain. You're glowing from that holiness," and that's what's going on in this Transfiguration. There is this divine glow to these three, Jesus and these two absolute heroes of the Old Testament. that's a mountaintop experience. When it's over, Jesus says to his disciples,
Don't tell anyone.
don't tell anybody about this.
That's another thing. Every time Jesus does a miracle or something like that, don't tell anyone. Why?
There are various theories about that. The one that I like the best is the one that's basically saying, keep this a secret, okay?
Everybody won't.
And
Oh.
yeah,
But
And-
why?
and I'm only gonna tell Mike, and Mike's only gonna tell Sandy, and Sandy's only gonna tell, and on and on. Everybody knows.
That's what Joel said this afternoon. He said,
Reverse
Tell
psychology.
Yeah, I think so. Now I can't prove that's what's
That shows he was
going
very
on,
smart.
but I think it is. I think it's maybe a combination of that and Jesus, even as he's teaching his disciples, he's clear that they're not ready to receive the fullness of his message.
well, they haven't had the Holy Spirit yet.
Right. They and they and he kind of upbraids them and kind of kids them on a number of occasions for being kind of dull. You still don't understand.
Fishermen.
Slow.
Right. And but it's also there's kind of a sense that of course they don't understand. They're in the midst of what is
Unbelievable.
cosmic changing events. And for them to be confused about what's going on is to be expected. We would be surprised if they weren't confused.
Right.
There's another, go ahead, Mike.
So just, I don't mean to interrupt, but
No problem.
yeah, I was looking at that a little differently, that, you know, Jesus was very humble, I felt. So he was kind of downplaying his miracles, just being you know, having humility. Is that possible, or is that?
I think that's possible, and I think that's consistent with, you know, another another explanation is that he really didn't want to just attract people to a circus.
Yeah, circus
Oh,
sideshow.
Here, the
Right.
miracle, you know, the miracle worker is going to be in Nazareth next Monday.
Mm.
Right.
And yet, in fact, that is what happens.
Sure.
People run ahead of him and say, Jesus is on his way. And they gather and bring all of their sick people to welcome him when they come into a town, when he comes into a town. It's just interesting dynamics, but I think your explanation is a reasonable one, Mike. Besides that transfiguration, there's another huge mountaintop experience in Mark's gospel, and that is at Jesus' crucifixion. We already talked about the transfiguration, and kind of the meaning of that is, again, like the baptism, and in one version of this, we also hear the voice of God. I don't think Mark has that, but we hear the voice of God saying, this is my son, my beloved. So that's that, you know, that clear identification of Jesus as the Messiah. Then we go back down into the valley, and we have more encounters with skeptics and so on. Eventually he gets arrested. He gets a kangaroo court, convicts him. The Romans give in, and he is crucified up on a mountain outside Jerusalem. And when he when he dies, the centurion who has just officiated at the execution, the centurion
Really?
looks at the dying or just dead Jesus and says, surely this was the Son of God. This is the Roman centurion, an outsider in every way, confessing at the death of Jesus that he is the Son of God. And and that's essentially how Mark's gospel ends, except with the, then he's buried, and then he's not there when they come to see him, but the angel tells the women he has been risen, he has been raised. Okay. Stop there for, we've got about 6 or 7 minutes left. Let's see if you've got some questions. Again, keep in mind that that Mark is writing, if we use the date, somewhere around 60. Paul has already written all of the books of the Bible that we know of as being from Paul. Those are, because Paul was martyred in Rome in 64. So his ministry and his writings are from around 50 to around 60, well, to 64. He was writing when he was under house arrest. That's the earliest presentation of Christianity, is Paul's writings. The gospel, in this case, the gospel of that we call Mark, was not written, and again, until 60 or so AD, toward the very end of Paul's life. Politically, what's happening is that when Mark is writing, there is this growing tension between the Jews and the Christians, but there hasn't yet been a break. There's arguing going on, but it's interfamily arguing still, for the most part. Now, we do have early instances of martyrdom, where people are executed for being Christians, but that's few and far between for a generation or so. By the time Luke and Matthew are writing their gospels, things have changed, and the Jews and the Christians have really separated from one another, and the Romans have reinvaded Israel, what was then called Judea, reinvaded Israel and devastated it. There was a Jewish rebellion, and the Romans came in and basically flattened Jerusalem and became very, very heavy-handed occupiers of what we call the Holy Land. So that's a tension that's going on in Matthew and Luke that's not present in Mark. There's those two have specific focuses on relation to Judaism and relation to the the Roman government. Mark doesn't have a particular, I mean, it was not a major concern for Mark.
Later.
Oh, yeah.
Other questions?
No,
There was one more thing I wanted to say about Mark, and then it's escaping me. Oh, yes. The very beginning of Mark, Mark just opens with, what is it? The gospel of Jesus Christ.
The Son of God.
Okay. So he's pretty much two things that are important there. He's pretty much put out the thesis. This is the gospel of Jesus Nazareth, the Son of God. Here's an important thing to understand that Mark is doing here. The term that we in English translate as gospel, evangelion, is what it is in Greek.
Good news.
Pardon me?
Good news.
Good news is how we ultimately translate it in English. But the origin of that word is when a king had the king's wife presumably had a son, and therefore an heir. The king would send out a gospeler to the whole kingdom, and it was basically a declaration that there is good news for everyone. The king has a son. That's the only use of that term gospel that's known in ancient times, until Mark uses that term, just kind of grabs it out of a well-established tradition and says, I'll give you some good news about a son being born. Here's good news for you. And he uses the term gospel. We're so used to the word now that it just means good news. Okay, it's just a narrative, but it was intended in this very, very first opening remarks of Mark to make a bold statement of his thesis, and to present that as good news for all people. We're at our time. Let's see if there are questions before we stop.
like good news means the kind of glad tidings, then kind of that.
It's the I mean, that's a different gospel. That's
okay.
Luke's gospel. That's Luke's gospel that has the angels. But it's certainly consistent, and it's good news for all people.
Okay.
It's a consistent message.
Okay.
It's just not again. It's Mark that calls his work the gospel. It's not even that he's calling his book the gospel. It's this presentation, this is the good news about the Son of God. So there's a newborn Son of God, and it's Jesus.
So did the other kings then continue to use the word gospel when they had a son and after that, or did Mark kind of commandeer that word?
I don't know for certain, but I would guess that it probably, as it became more popular in its Christian use, it probably declined in its secular use. but
Sure,
that's just a conjecture on my part.
All right,
And
so
of
what-
course, eventually Christianity dominated the Roman Empire and, was able to establish some stuff that that only government can do. Iris, you had a question.
I was gonna say, what homework are you giving us that only Martha and Jules did? Okay.
Read the rest of the
Oh,
Bible.
I did some.
Oh, okay, March, good, okay.
Marge,
What-
you're on. I'm so glad.
What are we on? Are we done, Mark, going to Matthew then or what?
I would like to suggest that those of you who haven't read haven't read Mark, go ahead and during the week read Mark, if you're able to, if at all possible. See if you can find 2 hours, hour and a half to read the whole thing in one sitting.
Oh, it take me longer than that.
It took us 3.5 hours. this
Did it?
afternoon. Yeah,
Yeah, but we were reading both Bibles
Yeah.
alternately.
So cut that in half. Yeah. No. So
Not quite.
in any case, there's benefit in taking it in as a whole, but
yeah, which is what we
it's-
did, yeah.
it's also a larger
Ah.
task and not realistic for everybody.
Oh,
are
so
we-
read Mark. You want us to read Mark
Yes,
in
Oh.
one setting?
yes.
And I
I
think
have
And-
ADHD. I can't do that.
Okay, that's fine. You can
Whatever.
do that and do some
Two
stamp
settings.
making or something at the same time. Right?
Ah,
Okay.
You, and what I'd like to do next week is start with, and maybe you guys want to make notes, but what I want to do is start with, for those of you who just read through Mark for the first, right now for the first time, yeah, recently. What are some of the examples of things that we talked about today? And do you see some dynamics that we didn't catch
Okay.
in our discussion
You'll have to go.
today? Okay,
So
Yeah.
next week will still be on Mark, correct?
we'll be on Mark, but leading into Matthew and Luke.
Okay.
What we're going to be talking about. We're not going to be talking about Luke or Matthew specifically next week. The following
Okay.
week we will. But next week we're going to be focusing especially on Mark as kind of the baseline gospel, and then where Matthew and Luke came from,
Hmm.
how they connect to Mark and how they're different from Mark, how they connect to each other, how they're different from each other.
Okay, got it.
I'm going to continue this Bible study into February. We have 2 Wednesdays in February before Ash Wednesday. So I'm going to continue this because I think it's really foundational, for us to, if we say we're gospel-oriented Christians, that's what evangelical means. It's in our name.
Okay.
It's also what Lutheran means. It's also what grace means. And as I've said before, our name means grace, grace-centered church.
I should tell you, my mother's father, my maternal grandmother, was raised Lutheran in Germany,
Mm.
and then came over here and married a Catholic man. So then but when she was a little child, she was babysat by a lady a teenage girl next door named Ruby. I remember that. And Ruby would read her the gospel, and she'd say to her, only thing you have to pay attention to are the red words. When you
Cute.
said that a little while ago, it just brought that back to,
Yeah,
Pay attention to the red words, because that's what Jesus said.
right,
Right.
And in
exactly,
the old Bibles, it was always in red when Jesus said it.
right.
Pay attention
Never
to
knew
the
that.
red words.
Right.
I never knew that.
Any other questions or comments?
No.
Then I will look forward to getting, I'm not going to be at church this Sunday. I'll be out of quarantine, but I'm not going to take any chances.
You can join
so-
via Zoom.
Paul, pardon me?
You can join via Zoom.
Yes, I'm very fortunate that my
Stay
church
well.
offers that option.
That's right.
So
Thanks,
Pastor
everybody.
Pfeffer will be there?
Pastor Pfeffer will be presiding and Mike Perone is going to preach.
Okay.
All right. Well, stay well.
Good.
Thank
Stay
you
well.
very much. You all too.
All
Bye.
Good night.
Thank
Thank
you,
you.
Pastor. Thank
Bye.
you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, good night.